Well, there are several things wrong with state. Although it is an institution that ought to be good at its job and could be with careful managerial attention over a little period of time, the main problem is that even by their own description, they are not hiring people who have the skills they say they need for contemporary diplomacy. So they're not hiring the right people. As you just pointed out, they keep them all, and they don't teach them anything in the meantime. The State Department expends all of its training resources on teaching languages, and yet of the jobs requiring language proficiency in the State Department, 25% of them, by state's own reckoning, are filled by people who cannot effectively use the language, another 25% by people who are not easily proficient in the language. So they have a 50% failure rate by their own standard on the sole area that they expend their training resources on. It's not a good business model. The way that the State Department, the career progression is that you take a diplomatic post, you're assigned to a diplomatic post for a couple of years, and then after that you go to language training and then go someplace else. We develop generalists in the American Foreign Service. We don't develop experts. So, for example, a talented young Foreign Service officer may be posted in Baghdad, and then, this is actually an example of someone I know, she will go to a couple of years language training and then be sent to Beijing. And so she will have had language training to go to Iraq, but probably not enough so that she would have felt comfortable having a discussion like you and I are now having in the language of the country she was operating in. And then she will get a year or two of language training and then be sent to China. It's an extraordinarily profligate professional development model. And I would just point out that kids come into the Palo Alto School District speaking 132 different languages already. We could actually hire people who have the language skills that we want. We don't actually have to teach them all that. So it's a business model that you would never start with. And the culture of the State Department replicates, they select people who have the skills of the people already there. So the example that you pointed out, the Foreign Service actually has an admissions rate, the equivalent of Stanford University. You have as high a likelihood of getting admitted into Stanford as you have of becoming a member of the U.S. Foreign Service. We ought to be able to pick anyone we want. And the people we pick are very good, but the institution doesn't make them any better over time. And that's something we should fix. Yeah, what she meant by that is that there's a defensiveness to the culture of the U.S. State Department that, for my favorite example of it is Secretary Clinton's quadrennial diplomacy and development review. This is a great thing she did. It was the first time a Secretary of State had done it. She did a once every 4 years look at the institution to set priorities. And it was a good first start, but it's got a long ways to go before it's an effective management review. And one way you can tell that is that Secretary Clinton opened it by saying, you know, we set out to figure out how to make ourselves better. And the conclusion they came to is, if you only gave us more money and more people, we could be better. And so the vision of the Pentagon from the State Department is that they get all the money they want, that the work that the Foreign Service does is every bit as difficult and dangerous, and yet everyone likes the military and there's no constituency for foreign policy in this country. So only 2 million Americans avail themselves of consular service overseas every year. So it's not a very high number in a country of 310 million people. So I think the first thing is most Americans don't know they're diplomats, right? They're mostly posted overseas. The Foreign Service Institute, where they do their training, is here in Washington. So in Spokane, Washington State, or Duluth, Minnesota, they probably don't know them. And the Foreign Service could actually do itself a huge favor by stitching itself more closely into American society. I have some suggestions in the book for ways they could do that. One would be that what American diplomats like about themselves is complicated multinational negotiations, things like the climate change discussions in Copenhagen, right? Because it's hard, it's intellectually difficult to master the material, there are lots of moving pieces. What Americans actually value about the State Department is if your brother gets arrested in El Salvador, an American diplomat's going to go see him in jail, make sure that he's being treated fairly, ensure that the protections that any American citizen should have anywhere in the world are afforded him. And the State Department views that as its least important responsibility. The culture doesn't reward it. Its most talented people don't go into consular affairs. There was a study done recently suggesting that so the State Department complains that after September 11th, so much funding and attention went to security and consular affairs. And yet, American diplomats are the first line of defense for protection of our country. They're the people who give visas to foreigners who might come to the United States. And the people who do that are our youngest foreign service officers. It's a required first tour to be posted somewhere doing. Their workload is enormous, and they don't get lots of attention, and yet they do it fantastically. Why doesn't the State Department celebrate those young diplomats? Because my mom would actually be thrilled. That would make her like the Foreign Service. But seeing an undersecretary come sweeping out of the Copenhagen negotiations doesn't do much for my mom. This is actually not the State Department's fault. The Congress, out of concern about protecting American diplomats, and in particularly after the bombings of the American embassies in Nairobi in the Clinton administration, Congress started legislating much better protection. But it has the dysfunctional outcome that you say. It's actually not making American diplomats safer because it's so difficult to get into an American embassy that they go out to have their meetings. So they are less well protected, although they are doing their jobs well. They're out and about in foreign societies, being the American that people see. Yeah, it is Dean Acheson writing on December 8th, 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. He was, at that time, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, and he was exasperated to see that the State Department wasn't better at its job when he goes on to say, further on in that same passage, that what the State Department needed to be doing was acquiring the resources that the war machine would need and keeping them out of the hands of our enemies. And he found the State Department signally unable to do that. You know, I went to work in the Pentagon as my first real job. And one of the things I was really struck by, since I didn't grow up in a military family and I didn't know the culture, I was really struck that mostly what the American military is brilliant teachers, because they live in an environment where you can't be good at your job unless you can make everyone else good at their job. And I was the person everyone had to make good at their job. And when I went to the State Department 20 years later, I was struck that the people who are successful in the State Department are people you can throw into the deep end of the pool and they're not going to drown, but nobody ever teaches them to swim. Moreover, the best of them don't even value swimming lessons because, after all, they didn't drown. And so it's a culture that makes very little of the enormous human capital it has. And with a little bit of attention and basic management, you could actually realign the incentive structure and make it as well functioning as the military is. You know, the military's great at making a lot out of very little, and the State Department could be too. We just don't hold them to the same standard. And my argument in the book is to try and show that we shouldn't let inherently civilian responsibilities accrue to the military in the way that they have since September 11th. That's actually bad for our country. We need to make the people whose job it is, it's important to the world to see civilians doing civilian foreign policy. And we actually need to make the State Department capable of doing that. I did not find that myself. What I found instead was a culture that believes itself Praetorian in a sense, namely that they're the guardians of American foreign policy against all of these politicians. So, for example, the Foreign Service complains. There was an editorial in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago by Ambassador Pickering and a few others arguing against political appointees being named to senior ambassadorial posts. But there's actually no evidence that political ambassadors are any less good at their job than the career Foreign Service officers. In fact, sometimes they are better because they understand the president's agenda and have the kinds of connections to the White House that allow them to advance the agenda. Very often the State Department pulls itself into believing its job is to protect American foreign policy against the people who get elected to run the country. And that's of either political bias, political persuasion, I should say. And that's part of the reason Congress doesn't like them. It's part of the reason they don't resonate with the broader American public. Oh, well, I wouldn't burden her with all of my views, but she gave me a couple of very good interviews for the book, and I was working as the Deputy for Policy Planning in the State Department when she was Secretary. So I got to watch her struggle with trying to fix some of these problems. You may remember there was a notorious incident where she was doing a town hall meeting with Foreign Service officers, some of whom were complaining that they didn't want to be deployed to Iraq because it was dangerous. And that, I think, that is not characteristic of the people of the Foreign Service, but it is characteristic of the problems we need to fix in the culture. And the people of the Foreign Service are actually terrific. They do dangerous work with almost no attention, and they never have enough resources to do it. But they go out in the world and try and tell people about the United States and what we're doing in the world. So the people are terrific. The institution needs to get deserving of them, and we're not yet. So the policy planning staff is a small 25-person staff that works directly for the Secretary, and they're the kind of in-house critics. They try and dream up ideas that the bureaucracy itself wouldn't produce for the Secretary. They second guess what's going to the Secretary. So as you can tell, they're widely popular. But in fact, half of the staff of policy planning are Foreign Service officers, professional diplomats who come because they want an opportunity to get away from the constraints of consensual policy making and try and float their best ideas to the Secretary. It was really inspiring to work there because the people are fun and exciting. Let me just give you one example. We had someone someone who did polling about Iranian public attitudes, things that people who have ideas that Iranians would vote for in their parliamentary elections. But of course, the Iranian Supreme Council vets candidates. So we created fake internet candidates who had the views that Iranians wanted to vote for, and tens of thousands of Iranians actually voted for them in the election. It was such fun mischief to do. And the department was supportive of it. You couldn't have done that from within the Bureau of Middle Eastern Affairs, but you could do it from policy planning. And we had at that time a really terrific director, David Gordon, who was a career intelligence officer, who was not afraid of ideas he didn't agree with. And so he was a perfect leader for that kind of outfit. It was a privilege to work for him. It's really true. If you ask the Marine Corps what they do, you'd get a straight answer, right? Every Marine is a rifleman. If you ask a diplomat, what do they do? It's much harder because they have a much more diffuse focus, but it also means that the leadership of the institution is not conveying its core values and central responsibilities. And if you don't do that, people very quickly lose focus. And on the programming part of the reason that Congress trusts the Pentagon with an enormous amount of the taxpayers' money is because the Pentagon provides a lot of information and does assessments of whether it's worth it. So think about Dave Petraeus when he was commanding in Iraq during the surge, and Congress was deeply skeptical that the surge was working. What did the military do? They identified what they thought the right metrics were for which to hold themselves accountable. number of intelligence tips they were getting from Iraqis, number of attacks on American troops. They collected data over the course of a whole year. They made that data public so scholars could second guess whether anyone had better ideas than they did. And it was on that basis that they changed congressional attitudes. The power of ideas and the power of actually proving your case is how to win policy debates with the Congress. And the State Department doesn't have the bureaucratic machinery to build a budget that's defensible in the way the Defense Department's is. And I'm a very strong advocate. Deep in my heart, I'm an insurance actuary. And I think we need green eye shade budgeteers who will make the State Department's budget as bulletproof as the Defense Department's is. I was a student of Condi Rice's here at Stanford. I had a grand idea about writing my PhD on the renaissance of the Latin American novel in the 1970s and what this tells us about the role of literature and art in repressive societies. And I did not do that, and Condi Rice is the reason I did not do that. So we have American embassies in every country that we have diplomatic relations in. And that makes a certain amount of sense. But if you tried to re-envision how to spend our resources on diplomacy, it's not entirely clear to me that Luxembourg would need an embassy of its own when Belgium is next door and the European Union does a lot of its diplomatic work in Brussels now. So it seems to me possible that given American predominance in the international order, much of the work that we want to do diplomatically, the high politics of state-to-state relations, that mostly gets done in Washington. What we need American embassies for out in the world are to take care of Americans when they're traveling and to be involved in local activities in other societies. So the great democratization that the communications revolution and other things of our modern age have brought forward mean that we don't so much need an embassy in Berlin to be talking to the German government, but we need to be out at community meetings, seeing what new political parties are doing, working, the FBI working with the German counterpart on terrorism issues. A lot of those kinds of things we don't need embassies to do necessarily. And states doing some interesting experimentation about whether we can create virtual access centers, for example. Where you really, really need embassies is in societies where there isn't free transmission of information. My favorite example is Ambassador Ford in Damascus, who I think at the start of the Syrian civil war did an enormously powerful and important job for the United States by going to the funerals of political dissidents who had been killed by the government, showing that Americans care about that, giving interviews about what the Assad government was doing. That's American diplomacy at its finest, and that's what we need to free the State Department up to be out doing in the world. It's been a pleasure.